keeps an oath even when it hurts, who does not change his mind. Well, that's the kind of person I want to be. I'm pretty sure you want to be that kind of person too. But these people are rare. We talked about it yesterday, last time, that it's a rare thing for people to be solid when they give their word. The King James Version says, who sweareth to their own hurt and repenteth not. In other words, when it gets really difficult to keep an oath, these people don't drop the oath. There are so few of those people. A lot of people today, it hasn't just been today, or else David wouldn't have included that particular phrasing in his profile, this character profile of a person who has and desires a deep intimacy with God. It's part of the human condition that when things get hard, we kind of like to back away. I do. I understand that. Difficulty for most people is not desirable. But for people of real character, people of depth, honest people who keep their word, difficulty is just part of the picture. Who keep an oath. Now, the Old Testament talks about vows and oaths more than the New Testament, but Jesus talked about vows and oaths. And he said it this way, let your yes be yes and your no be no. In Jesus' day, it was practice that you would swear by the gift on the altar, or the altar itself, or the gold in the temple, or on and on and on it goes. When I was a little boy, people would say, I swear on my mother's grave. Well, no, I don't. It was just a way to overstate that I really mean this, which probably 60% of the time or more was just a ploy to get you to believe they were on track, whether they were or not. But for a follower of Jesus, our word is our bond. When it gets hard, we address it in the grace of Christ, and we maintain our integrity by keeping our word, by not changing our mind about the commitments that we've made. That kind of makes me want to point to this fact that this whole profile of the person who can dwell in the holy tent, the sacred tent, and who can live on the holy mountain, really, this is a profile of a genuine, consistent, growing, maturing follower of Jesus. This is a profile of someone whose commitment is solid. And I think every follower of Jesus would do themselves well we don't need to give ourselves grades, but to observe our lives and discern, are there areas of my character that need to be addressed? And the answer to that is always going to be yes. Now, Ben Franklin was not a devoted follower of Jesus. He was a Renaissance man. But he understood that his character was supreme in terms of the value of his life. And when he was fairly young, he took 12 character traits and spent 1 month each in full-on focus for developing that character trait. Of course, by the end of the year, he was not perfect, but he felt he had grown. I wonder if it's kind of we're not quite done with this whole profile, but we're close. It's a good time for me to say, if you wanted to take our Soul Care with Stevie Boy encounters to a deeper level, you would need to either work from your computer, your tablet, your phone, a piece of paper with a pen, but look at these character qualities and list them individually, and then evaluate, observe. Let me back up. For many people, I'd say even for most, evaluating is a judgmental activity. When we look into our own lives and we look at others and we make an evaluation, it is more often a judgment rather than an observation. And I know the line is thin, but really what that line involves is whether I am taking a position, a role, authority that only God has, or am I observing my life in order to make course corrections in partnership with His grace? I know I've made it very convoluted, but that's really the bottom line. And as I look at these character qualities, these character traits of what really amounts to a God-fearing, God-honoring, God-following person, my observations should provide me with data that tell me where course correction is necessary. And I can't pull myself up by my own bootstraps for this. I have to depend on the grace and love of God to give me what I need to make these course corrections, whether they're big or not so big. Who keeps an oath even when it hurts and does not change their mind. And then he goes on. And now this may be the most runway kind of, out of the clouds, out of the philosophical and ideological, down here on the runway, down where the rubber meets the road. Who lends money to the poor without interest. In Israel, the God's law commanded that an Israelite was never to lend money to another Israelite at interest. The first time I ever came across that concept, because I hadn't read the Bible for myself yet, was I was in my 20s and I was reading from C.S. Lewis, and he said, he pointed to this concept in the Old Testament, in the law, and then he said, what is our economic system based on today? Most of our economy is based on lending with interest. There are some industries and there are some commercial efforts that they don't borrow and they don't lend. That's the very tiny majority. Nearly all the industries and all the commerce that goes on in the world, especially in the U.S., involves borrowing and lending money at interest. I don't think that's sinful, but I do think it sets up some interesting dynamics on the philosophical side of things. Solomon in Proverbs said the borrower is always slave and the lender is always master. Yes, when you borrow money, you become a slave to whomever you borrowed the money from, in the sense that you have an obligation. Now, today, interest rates are exceedingly low. I don't remember them ever being as low in my lifetime as they are today, but with all that's happening in the world and with the escalating infrastructure problems and all of the inflation that's going on, there are rumors that the Fed's going to raise the interest rate, but when it does, it won't raise it by 5 or 10%. Interest is low enough now that if you need to borrow, for instance, mortgage rates are at a tremendously low rate today, and if you need to borrow for a house, nearly everybody does, the rates are low, and this is a great benefit. The problem still is that the borrower is a slave to the lender. Nobody in their right mind today is going to lend money for a home at zero interest. I can't say nobody. I'd say almost nobody. I don't know of any institutions that are doing this. And this is not really what David was talking about. Look, he doesn't say money should be lent at no interest to anyone and everyone for any and every reason. No. They lend money to the poor without interest. You can quickly see that now, instead of everybody out there, we're talking about a finite, and honestly, in our culture and in a Jewish culture, a small demographic. First of all, they lend to the poor without interest because the poor have nothing to pay the interest with. They would be stretched to the breaking point to pay back the principal. And so it's very nearly just a logical step. These people can't afford to pay interest. Out of integrity, out of compassion, we don't charge interest. Why? Well, because, this is just my opinion, I think since LBJ, President Johnson, in the mid-60s began his failed social experience of the Great Society, our country has been on a pathway of giving money freely to the poor. And essentially now, how many years later? 50, almost. Yeah, 50 years later. 60 years later, we're looking at it and realizing all we have done is promulgated the poverty. We have not expunged the poverty. We haven't lifted people out of poverty. All we've done is we've continued the trend of poverty. And I think this is why. Because what you don't ever have to pay for, you often value lightly. I know this is easy for me to say. I'm not poor. And it's easy for me to throw rocks. I'm not throwing rocks at the poor. I'm just talking about human nature. I have no problem throwing rocks at the system because I think the system is broken. It's founded on bad ideology. Well, lay that aside and let's think about this. For money to be lended or lent to the poor, that's different than given away to the poor. When money is lended to me, I'm required to pay it back. There's a moral conscience that says I need to pay that back. So this is a generosity factor. Because if the Jew were lending to a Gentile or someone outside, which anybody outside the Jewish community was Gentile, they could charge interest, but not to a fellow Jew. Now, David says it even becomes more significant to lend without interest to the poor. Why? Because only generous people will do that. My generosity is not bailing somebody out. it is empowering them to move out of poverty into a form of independence that can eventually become interdependence. We're going to talk more about this next time because it's kind of a complicated subject. But you don't have to be a politician or a political scientist or even a sociologist to get it. That's why it's in the Bible. We'll start there again next time on So Care with Stevie Boy.